All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We focus on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, tour de forces, grand unified theories, um, people who spent their whole life working on something or a large chunk of their life working on something and never really got recognized. And we just try to shed light on these things and do deep dives into them so that you can use them yourself in your own life. However, these things plug into your life, but especially for your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. Today is our 7th day of reading over the work called It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? And this is a story, history, of two relatively obscure groups of jazz musicians in Chicago, so-called jazz, and how they went against their kind of immediate traditions and tried more to embrace their traditions way back when a musician was more of a spiritual leader and a healer. And the challenges that they went through going through such a process. And, also how to use their music in a way that kind of spreads to you as well. So the two groups are the Sun Ra Orchestra and the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, AACM. And this is chapter 2. We're a few sections into chapter 2, which is on, it's called Orchestration. It's on Sun Ra, like putting together his band. So the first chapter was went over a lot of his earlier history, and now he's kind of in Chicago and trying to put together a band. What kind of things he's considering when kind of recruiting people. Okay, this section is called Inverting Freedom. Sun Ra scoffed at the dissenting freedom, so-called, of the bebop movement. Accordingly, he had different requirements for his musicians. First, he commanded authority and insisted that they give him total obedience. Quote, to be as obedient to somebody walking around in human flesh as they are to death. He strongly opposed the freedoms taken by bebop musicians along with their demands for equality with the band leader. He preached, a black teenager would march into the courthouse. He wanted to go with some people, and the policeman stood in front and said, you can't go. He said, don't you believe in the rights of a man, that all men are equal? And the policeman say, well, in nature, there's not equality anywhere. No two leaves alike, no two anythings alike. I believe in nature. The black teenager stopped startled, and he backed up because he had to, because it was the truth. Also, he says, this is not a freedom ship. This ship is based on discipline. Was also a common exhortation. Indeed, Ra thought of his orchestra as a as a mission. Again, it's the orchestra, so when he's talking about a ship there, he thought of his orchestra as a mission, a spiritual order. To join, you had to first go through a process of initiation. He was known to rehearse individual musicians for long periods before letting them make a public debut. Sun Ra viewed the orchestra as a band or ship of mercenaries, fighting for his conception of creative inversion, to serve the creator rather than the self, a higher calling. He thought bebop musicians had been inspired but trapped by the mediated worldview in the individualist cults of so-called freedom and equality. He felt his message was important because jazz in the form of bop was in danger of losing vitality. Sun Ra believed that jazz was being taught and then learned in a way that was destructive, not creative. Foremost among the teachings of the bop school was the relationship between jazz and freedom. The history of jazz itself has been viewed by commentators and musicians alike as a long dialectic struggle between freedom and restraint, and bebop has been seen as the greatest victory for freedom. Given his musical background, Sun Ra must have been sympathetic to the bop ethic, but in his belief, bebop only created the potential of freedom. In the same way, inspiration represented only the potential of creativity. Sun Ra claimed that the American concept of freedom was illusory and most often turned into addictions, evidenced by the bebop small group combo. Frequent solo and rhythmic improvisation gave combo musicians a freedom they would never have had in a large orchestra. But over time, all but the most resourceful of the combo musicians began to repeat cliches while improvising. For that reason, Sun Ra needed inversion to turn bebop's belief in freedom upside down. Quote, "Freedom must give way to interplanetary discipline. We must have discipline, discipline, discipline 24 hours a day." In Sun Ra's career, he sought to take musicians formerly under the influence of freedom and turn them around to put them under his own discipline. In many ways, Alan Ehrenhalt, in his study of 1950s Bronzeville, expresses Ra's viewpoint. Quote, "Any dream of freedom without authority would turn out to be a pipe dream in the end." Sun Ra recalled the tradition of black orchestra leaders in this country. Bebop, as an artist revolt, demonstrated a victory, but that victory was quickly mediated by institutional arranging and recording. In bebop, there was no system in place for generating new musical ideas, increasing freedom over time. The freedom led to addictions because it would eventually run out. After the supply of freedom exhausted itself, it turned into a dependency. According to Ra, bebop's, quote, "a petty kind of freedom, dangerous and destructive, not life-giving. It's like stocking up food in your house and believing you are self-sufficient. Eventually, the resources are going to disappear." End quote. In bebop, as a result of peer or authority pressure, the focus had gradually shifted away from music and towards celebrating and repeating the bebop idiom, with only limited creative variations in soloing. Ra saw freedom as a problem in bop music, and he tried to get bop musicians to renounce it. Sun Ra won the allegiance of some bop musicians because of his endless supply of creative musical ideas, with no need for cliches. But he also required that band members obey his orders. He claimed, in fact, that a musician would have more freedom submitting directly to his authority than he would have had playing with no external constraints whatever. At least one musician agreed, quote, "He would actually control you, but make you think you were doing it yourself. He would control you and he wouldn't control you. It was like for the first time under his control, for the first time you were free. You were doing things freer than you have ever done before in your life." Through disciplined Kabbalistic practices, Sun Ra taught musicians that they were ultimately free to ignore the emotional memories of past freedoms that manifested in the form of cliches. Through cliches and other forms, the bebop transgression was gradually funneled into the institutional worldview. As jazz became more popular with the white elite class, they began to publish articles and reviews for jazz journals glorifying jazz and jazz musicians. Again, however, because of the racial imbalance, those white supporters of jazz eventually served to misrepresent the original creative invention in bebop. The jazz journals were actually published by those close to the record industry, and they were used as another arm of advertising to alert consumers of the newest records and styles, and in many cases to give so-called objective reviews of the records from supposed critics. In this way, the jazz critics' standards could stand in for the musicians. And since the jazz journal was the musician's primary way to get exposure, many musicians gradually began to cater to the tastes of critics. Eventually, a set of cliches or pet phrases emerged. Musicians would use them repeatedly when they were out of more creative ideas. The critics' columns contained Black inspiration in music by setting standards that suited the tastes and needs of white culture, not Black culture. Through cliches and other compromises, the hip inspiration of bebop became the cool disengagement of the critic. Arranged from the start, this unsustainable form of cool opposition became an increasingly favorable alternative to the institutional worldview for a younger generation of dissatisfied Americans. So if you don't know, there was, two schools of bop music that developed. One was more of the East Coast school called hard bop or just bop, and then the West Coast school was really called cool bop, cool jazz or cool bop. So that's where that's kind of coming from. The cool disengagement of the critic kind of set the tone for a lot of the cool jazz. There's some, great music from the cool school as well. But the question isn't really so much is it great music, but is this sustainable? Okay, back to the text. On the other hand, Sun Ra sought musicians who wanted to be free of the influence of cliches. Predictably, in his recruiting, Sun Ra valued dedication over musical ability. It was a prerequisite that members be able to read music, but mostly he recruited musicians who were ready to, quote, deal with the regimen. He claimed, quote, "I don't have earthmen in my band. Everybody in my band was carefully chosen for the spirit content of the future." His preference was for, quote, musicians who believed in orchestration, discipline, and precision. And as later member James Jackson claimed, quote, "Sonny has the ability to pick those people who are going to fit." Jackson fit in well, in part because he understood that, quote, "you have to give up pleasures to play in the orchestra." In the orchestra, Sun Ra remained above questioning and often went to extreme lengths to maintain authority. Once, he said, an orchestra musician argued with Sun Ra, accusing Sun Ra of being selfish. Not denying it, Sun Ra countered by saying, quote, "You don't run this band. You can't be telling me as a leader, you can't be telling me what to do, because you don't do that to leaders. You do what the leader said." His authority applied particularly to music. He described what happened when a musician would attempt to assert his ego in rehearsal. Quote, "Every time he thinks he's going to play his regular thing, I make a wrong chord, and then it's disturbing." The last place Sun Ra wanted musicians was into their regular thing, because their regular thing was a product of representation. For this reason, he also discouraged encounters with the media. One time, drummer Tommy Hunter recalled, A writer came to write about Sun Ra, who came to write about Sun Ra, got interested in a story about Hunter. And the article about, quote, and the article about me was longer than the article about Sun Ra. Sun Ra got mad and put me way in the back next time we played. This next section is called The Higher Mission. Several musicians learned to accept these seemingly despotic procedures. John Gilmore contended, quote, we're like pupils with the master. His bandmate Patrick added, we're nobodies with the master. Regardless of this level of obedience, though, Sun Ra would still use seemingly petty tactics to affirm his authority. Hunter, who served as the main editor for Sun Ra's recordings in the earlier years, remembers, quote, say for instance he was mad at Pat or he was mad at John and he wanted to cut their solo out, and he would tell me or show me what he wanted to cut out, and it was the best part of their solo. It is certainly possible that, according to Sun Ra, this was not the best part of their solo, but Hunter also remembers saxophonist Danny Thompson, who was in charge of orchestra itinerary for many years. Quote, Danny couldn't really tell you what was going on because Sun Ra didn't permit it, because Sun Ra didn't want to be contradicted, and that's why I was never allowed to talk. I mean, I could go take Sun Ra to an interview, and they wanted to interview me, and Sun Ra wouldn't let them interview me. So I asked Sun Ra, why do you do that? He says, well, because you tell the truth, and my thing is not about the truth. You know, my thing is about the myth. Whether truth or myth, Sun Ra claimed, quote, I never had no dissension in my band. Rather, he sought a higher mission, quote, to have some people around you who have the hope and the faith of what you're talking about is really necessary and can be potentially successful. It's very wonderful indeed, and therefore that makes this band very unique, because they weren't with me for money. So they're here for some unknown reasons. They're here with me because of something that can't be explained. Like a, end quote. Like a military commander, Sun Ra would insist that members play just as he instructed them during rehearsal. Unlike typical military leaders who taught obedience through coercion, intimidation, and aggression, Sun Ra used a more subtle form of influence over his band. Trumpeter Phil Coren described this process. If Ra, quote, didn't like what you were playing, he'd apply corrective measures. He'd change the musical background behind you, like play a wrong chord. It was kind of like sheep herding. Trombonist Julian Priester recalls, quote, Sun Ra was an enigma for me because he would he would write something out and it would only be a sketch of what he really wants. And then he would go through a process of changing that original idea around. So by the third or fourth rehearsal, there was nothing familiar on that paper. Everything was committed to memory, and it started to grow from that. And he would still add ideas to what he was directing every day. Sun Ra was a genius at it. He sort of directed us and kept us in the dark at the same time. Still, Sun Ra refrained from being unrealistic and abusing authority in musical matters. John Gilmore explained that there were many times that the musicians just did not understand what he was instructing them to do. Quote, Sonny would try something once, maybe twice, and if everybody wasn't with it, he'd just move on. Ra was patient when trying to, that's the end of the quote. Ra was patient when trying to teach music to orchestra members, but quite demanding when there was a question of their commitment. Another aspect of orchestration was the Ra jail. If Sun Ra didn't like what you were doing, for whatever reason, he might place you under house arrest and sometimes make you stand in the closet or other places of confinement so that you could think about your actions. Julian Priester remembers visiting the band for an audition and witnessing someone coming out of the closet. He asked Sun Ra, can I get something to eat? Yes, he said, but then get back into jail. Sun Ra did not deny being the warden, but he often said that the Ra jail was, quote, the best jail in the world. Since Chicago musicians were so caught up in individual freedom, however, many could not countenance the Ra jail. While bebop has been characterized as an anti-war movement, Sun Ra preferred musicians who were accustomed to military life. For Ra, quote, it's just the case that they're musicians, but you could say they're Marines, end quote. Inverting this notion, he referred to his band as, quote, the opposite of an army. The army was the best way to, end quote. The army was the best way to organize men, but not the best way to teach them, he thought. Quote, in the army, he said, you have to go through disciplined training. After that, in battle, you are confronted with something different from what you learned, so it's necessary to invent on the spot. If you're not capable of finding something else, you're not a good soldier. Military training definitely helped musicians get accustomed to the orchestra's work schedule. In addition to sometimes nightly performances, Ra scheduled at least 5 4-hour rehearsals per week, usually more. Ra was also known to call unexpected 4 a.m. rehearsals that would last all day. Drummer Ali Mora remembered, quote, we start rehearsal at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we rehearse till 2 in the morning, and we sleep like 4 hours, and here comes Sun Ra at 7 to me, Ali Mora, come on, wake up, I got this tune. One member recalled that to Sun Ra, quote, time had very little meaning when he was creating. To instill an ethic of group sacrifice, Sun Ra focused on a higher mission for his group. Unlike most African American leaders, he taught them, quote, that the rest of the nations have some sort of discipline or order of government, but African Americans haven't. I have to set up some sort of discipline program for black people. Sun Ra taught the orchestra about the higher role black musicians could play in the transformation of the world. Ra argued that in Africa, those who played music served as shamans, healers, historians, mythologists, and priests. The musicians dedicated themselves to serve the public. Today, they serve the public, but as agents of the institutional worldview. Ra lamented the difference. Quote, unfortunately, the black musician over here has been diverted into playing that sentimental music instead of playing the natural things we're supposed to play as black men. End quote. Orchestration was contingent upon musicians believing in Sonny's authority and mythology. This entailed countless hours of rehearsal, but also an equal amount of educational instruction in Ra's mythic inversion to get the musicians to face the creator rather than the institutions. He talked with them endlessly about the philosophical outlook behind the music, his omniverse view. Gilmore gave a good description, quote, Egypt, philosophy, Hebrew, his knowledge of the Bible. He was always far in advance, always researching. That's all we used to do in Chicago, study, 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 reading different types of books, different philosophies, Voltaire, Ouspensky, Russian philosophy, Madame Blavatsky, the fourth dimension, end quote. With such a wide variety, to say exactly what orchestra members learned is difficult, but Ra definitely got some of them to believe. Once, bassist Ronnie Boykins was rendered senseless in a car accident. When he regained consciousness in the hospital, an attendant asked Boykins his religion, and he promptly replied, cosmic philosophy. We may be able to surmise further what Ra taught by looking at the syllabus he gave to his students during a one-semester residence in Berkeley, California in 1970. For the course called The Black Man and the Cosmos, his list, according to John Schwed, included several rare books. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Radix, which is a 19th century astrology journal, Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, books on etymology, hieroglyphics, color therapy, African American folklore, the writings of ex-slaves, the theosophical works of Madame Blavatsky, spiritually channeled tomes like the Book of Oaspe, if that's how you pronounce it, Oahspe, Henry Dumas's poetry and short stories, Dr. Livingstone's travels in Africa, the Bible, and accounts of the origins of the Rosicrucians. While he was undoubtedly more well-versed by this later date, and his agenda may have slightly changed, the list is still a good indicator of what he learned in Chicago and Birmingham that he felt it was important to teach. In Schwed's account, a typical class at the Berkeley gig that he had found Sun Ra writing biblical quotes on the board and then permutating them, attempted inversion, rewriting and transforming their letters and syntax into new equations of meaning. His lecture subjects included Neoplatonic doctrine, the applications of ancient history and religious texts to racial problems, pollution and war, and a radical reinterpretation of the Bible in light of Egyptology. Sun Ra backed his views with a large body of esoteric literature that he knew well, and no doubt his teachings were greatly intensified for band members as opposed to college students. Although Sun Ra convinced many musicians, many others rejected him and left the band within a short period. Obviously, bebop musicians were not always crazy about the strict discipline, long hours, and inconsistent pay. The orchestra was also hard on a musician's ego. Musicians with a reputation to uphold were not interested in Ra's sheep-herding tactics in a rehearsal with peers in attendance. As Lucius Randolph remembered, quote, "You were trying to look your best, and here he was trying to make you look your worst." In a sentiment that echoes many military band leaders, Ra simply explained, quote, "Pride goeth before the fall." If the musician survived the attack on his pride, he had to learn to survive the attack on his pocketbook. In spite of some enthusiastic sponsors, funding was limited, and the orchestra was continuously in poverty. Ra's business acumen was not up to the standard of many other band leaders, and he sometimes appeared to engage in losing business deals on purpose. He theorized about the musicians who left him for financial reasons. Quote, "Black folks are too close to slavery. They worked 400 years, don't have nothing to show for it. They trying to make up for that. It's about money, 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 money." Many talented musicians left Ra for these reasons, but he was undaunted. Musicians who were interested in money or fame would have been much harder for him to control. Perhaps the aloof attitude about business served as a litmus test to see if particular musicians could be committed to something other than service to self. It was more important for Sun Ra to maintain absolute control of the band, even if it caused him to lose a few outstanding musicians. For Sun Ra, the bottom line was, quote, "If they can handle the discipline, they stay. If not, they go." Economic difficulties also gave Ra the opportunity to lead by example. As he believed that it was necessary to defer authority to leaders, he also believed that leaders had a higher standard to uphold to earn that authority. Quote, "Leaders are in trouble. They can talk that talk, but they better walk that walk. Something is watching leaders." He believed that, quote, "I have to work for the Creator whether I want to or not, and that's discipline. I have to do like the sun and the stars in the sky. They have to be right in place all the time. All superior beings have no freedom." He understood that, quote, superior beings had to force themselves to follow the law, even if they did not like it at first. Ra often complained about the mission given him by the Creator, and even alluded to arguing with the Creator to get it changed. In the end, however, he lost those arguments, and ambivalence gave way to perseverance. Life, therefore, was no easier for the leader than the follower. When the orchestra was in poverty, Sun Ra was in poverty. Orchestra members recognized that he could have made a comfortable living as a composer, arranger, or pianist, but instead chose, quote, to be the only thing I could be without anyone stopping me in America. That is, to be a failure. Furthermore, in the pursuit of failure, Sun Ra set an example with his work ethic. Percussionist Jim Herndon noted, quote, I think sometimes he went 2 or 3 days without sleeping. It seemed if he was working on something, he had limitless energy. In midst of a marathon rehearsal session, Sun Ra was known to take occasional naps at the piano. Pushing himself to the limit was common practice, in evidence when he left interviewers hanging by dozing off mid-sentence. Also, as he began to gain notoriety, he dealt with public relations with great zeal, as Mora remembers. Quote, Sun Ra is talking on the phone to somebody, writing an arrangement and playing the piano and correcting folks at the same time. With the example of commitment given by the leader, it was easier for orchestra members to obey when Ra called an unexpected 4 a.m. rehearsal, or when they didn't get paid after a gig because Sun Ra entered into a shaky financial agreement. Sun Ra's willingness to suffer for what he believed in gave him the charisma to convince disciples. By orchestrating a higher mission, Sun Ra turned his individual conscientious objection into a group movement. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there, and we'll start to take over tomorrow at that spot. We will, we'll start right there when we return tomorrow. So thanks for tuning in today, and have